Good evening. Hi, everyone. I'm Felicity from Penguin Teen. Welcome to the Pocket Change Collective Roundtable. I'm so excited to present our panel tonight, an amazing list of activists, of artists, of collaborators who have come together for the Pocket Change launch tonight. So, without further ado, I want to welcome Adam Eli, who is the author of The New Queer Conscience. Adam is a community organizer and a writer in New York City, and he's the founder of Voices For, a non-violent direct action activist group committed to advancing global queer liberation. He was included in Out Magazine's 100 Most Influential Queer People in 2018, and he believes that when you mess with one queer, you mess with all of us. Next up is Kimberly Drew. Kimberly is a writer, curator, activist, and she received her BA from Smith College in Art History and African American Studies. Her writing has appeared in Vogue, Glamour, W, Teen, and Lenny Letter, and she's executed Instagram takeovers for Prada, the White House, and Instagram. Her upcoming book, Black Features, which is co-editing with Jenna Wortham, will be released in late 2020. Next up is Shutezcat Martinez, who's the author of Imaginary Borders. Shutezcat is a 19-year-old Indigenous climate activist, hip-hop artist, and powerful voice on the front lines of global youth-led environment movement. His work has been featured in major media platforms such as PBS, The Guardian, Vogue, The Daily Show, Comedy Central, and HBO, and more. In 2013, he received the United States Community Service Award from President Barack Obama, and was the youngest of 24 national changemakers chosen to serve on the President's Youth Council. And last but not least, Alok Vaid-Menon, who is the author of Beyond the Gender Binary. Alok is a gender non-conforming writer and performance artist. As a mixed media artist, Alok uses poetry, prose, comedy, performance, lecture, fashion design, and portraiture to expose the themes of gender, race, trauma, belonging, and the human condition. And I should say explore, not expose. In 2019, they were honoured as one of the NBC's Pride 50 and Out Magazine's Out 100. They have their work presented at over 500 venues in more than 400 countries. Welcome, the Pocket Change Collective.
Hi.
Oh.
Hello. With so many great guests, I think I want to speak to each of you individually, and so I'm going to start with Shutezcat Martinez. Shutezcat, can you tell us a little bit about your book and how you came to write it?
Yes. Piali kwaliwali na natoka Shutezcat tanatiu nochanompa involved Colorado altepet. Iwanin kalpuli tlawitskali, iwanin kalpuli kwailama. Good evening to all my relatives, all my people tuning in. My name is Shutezcat Tanatiu. My people are the Mexica peoples, the indigenous peoples of Mexico Tenochtitlan, Mexico City. I'm here coming at y'all live from Lenape territory, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in the thick of a lot of really, really powerful uprising. And yeah, I wrote this book. I guess before I get to the book, it's I think an auspicious time for this series to be released to the world. I think there is so much energy right now that is being expressed. The people are on fire, like the people are rising up in a way that I think, we've seen glimpses of, that I've seen glimpses of throughout my lifetime. And the organizing and the work that I've done in the environmental and the climate space, has definitely, I think, informed a lot of how I see the world. And at the same time, I feel like I'm learning and just kind of like being reintroduced to this work on a daily basis. And even just, reading the books of the other authors that are a part of this collective, I'm just incredibly grateful for the leadership that exists amongst our generation, and that is really culminating at this moment in such a powerful way in this collective movement to defend Black lives, to be in solidarity with all of our Black relatives. And this book for me really came at the intersection of a lot of my own identities. As a indigenous person on my father's side, as a young Mexican man on my father's side, on my mom's side, having European heritage, mixed European background, and being an artist, being an activist, being, a spokesperson. I grew up with a lot of my life kind of in this like public setting as a working with the organization Earth Guardians to do different work in the climate space, from changing and fighting for local policy, in my community in Colorado, to traveling and representing youth voices at the United Nations and in different forums and spaces. And what I realized is so much of what was keeping our momentum, the climate justice movement from creating effective change was our our slowness to create narratives that were truly beyond a lot of these borders in this illusion of separation that our society has placed on so many of us. And so this book for me was a very kind of just like raw reflection on my journey and kind of how the work that I've done over the last like 14 years of my life has kind of been informed by the many different movements that I grew up around. Whether it was, being in ceremony with different elders and people that were, very involved in the American Indian movement. There it is, imaginary border, and beyond. And so I don't know. I think that the climate space specifically has been something that has failed to adequately represent how all-encompassing the crisis really is. That this challenge we are experiencing as a society is about so much more than energy policy. It is about so much more than just the United Nations or the way in which we address the changing weather, but it's really about overarching systems of injustice, about these structural transformation that needs to take place at this moment right now. So in the book, I kind of dive into these, different memories and ways that I was brought up, essentially, in my family's community in Mexico City, kind of my experience with being impacted on the front lines of the climate crisis and how my community, my family's experienced that. And then also my identity as an artist and using and leveraging the tool of hip hop as a performer, as a writer, as a recording artist, to continue to kind of push the boundaries on what our movements can feel and look and sound like. And acknowledging that, these, especially in these moments that we are seeing right now with just massive injustices across the country and different parts of the world, that there is such a need for us to build bridges and to dismantle these illusions of separation that have kept us apart, that have kept our movements fragmented, that have kept us, repeating a lot of these systems of injustice and colonialism that I think got us into the mess that we are in today. So I'm excited to share it with the world. I think, and again, even since I published the book, I feel like I've continued to learn and grow so much, but I'm excited for young people out there to be able to like reference this and use this as a place to, catalyze and really view the work that we do as much more interconnected, much more deeply interconnected than oftentimes these mainstream narratives allow us to believe or want us to believe, and yeah, grateful to be here, grateful to be a part of it, grateful to be among so many other powerful voices on the scene.
Thank you so much. That was lovely. Then our next guest is Adam Ely, who is the author of The New Queer Conscience. So I'm just going to hand it straight to you, Adam, to tell us the same. How did you come to write your beautiful book?
Thank you so much. I'm also really, really excited to be here, especially with my co-authors who I respect and look to so much. I'm in New York City. I live about 5 blocks outside of Union Square. And right now, I don't know if you can hear it, but I can hear police choppers and I can hear sirens. And I don't know if they're hospital sirens or police sirens. I assume they're police sirens. And I can hear chanting. And I just got a text that a big protest was not so peacefully dispersed by the police in Washington Square Park. And I just took a shower because I came from Union Square where things were really, really, really intense. And like Shutetkat was saying, I think this is an auspicious moment for change. And the core of my book is the idea that queer people have an obligation to show up for each other across every different identity line. And I call on that reasoning from my Jewish heritage. And so the book opens in which I compare how the Jewish people reacted to the Pittsburgh shooting in Philadelphia, and as compared to how the dominant, like the larger LGBT community reacted to three Black trans women being murdered within the span of a week, only a few weeks after. And I talk about how the majority of the queer community, especially the white, cis, gay male community, does not have a unified response in anger or effective action. And that's something that I really struggle with and can't understand. So I talk about my Jewish heritage. I talk about how I was taught through my parents' example that Jewish people show up for other Jewish people, and that's part of the DNA of being Jewish. And then I proceed to argue that the queer community will be better for everyone involved if we acknowledge that we all have something in common, which is that we were born into a world that was not created for us. And the book ends with 10 different direct calls to action about the way we can make the world, the way we can make our community a safer and more strong place. And the first of them, and the fifth one, is to realize that not all queer people are created equal, but the world does not treat us that way, and to ensure that queer people have an obligation to show up for all other marginalized people. And I speak in the book specifically about the Muslim ban and how, as a Jew, when the Muslim ban came down, it was so obvious that we had to protest. Like, my family and basically everyone I know came here as immigrants 3 generations ago to take an already persecuted religious minority and take away that life-saving mechanism was obvious. But also, 4 or 5 of those countries also have super, super, super harsh laws for trans and queer people. And so, like Shatazkat was saying, it's all interconnected. And the same thing goes, especially when we talk about police brutality and the queer community. And so I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to be in this moment. I'm excited to show up for this moment. And I'm really, really grateful that these books are coming out now. And I do think that the world needs to hear from them, and especially from my brilliant co-authors.
Absolutely, absolutely. And speaking of hearing from, if you're watching and you've got questions for any one of our panelists, please leave them in the comment section. We will absolutely have questions after all of our guests have spoken. So absolutely, please leave your comments and we will make sure that they see them and answer them on the show tonight. My next guest is Alok, and Alok Vaid-Menon is the author of Beyond the Gender Binary. Hi, Alok.
Hi everyone. Thanks so much for everyone tuning in. My book is a pamphlet on how to respond to the rising wave of transphobia all across the U.S. So in 2020, we have over 24 states that have introduced anti-trans legislation. States like Idaho, where 2 pieces of anti-trans legislation were actually approved during a pandemic. And what we're seeing is the scapegoating of trans and gender nonconforming people, and increasingly trans and gender nonconforming young people as responsible for the degradation of society. And this is an age-old strategy of taking a vulnerable minority and scapegoating them rather than taking responsibility where it belongs, and diverting people's energy and attention to policing arbitrary gender stereotypes and norms rather than actually organizing collectively for important issues like universal health care or universal basic income or free public education. And so what I try to do in this book is to show people how moving beyond the Western colonial gender binary, which has and continues to divide billions of people into one of 2 categories, and actually appreciating one another for our creativity and our complexity beyond our ability to conform to pre-existent structures and identity, creates a world which is more just and interdependent and beautiful. And to reframe the kind of narration of gender nonconformity as failure, to actually say gender nonconformity just is, that gender and sexual diversity are in fact intrinsic and fundamental components of human existence, and they always have been and always will be. So the book is divided into 2 parts. The first part, I recount my experiences growing up as a gender nonconforming person in a small town in Texas, and talk about the ways in which I was punished and policed into gender conformity as a way to make other people more comfortable with me. And then in the second part of the book, I outline all the arguments that people use to justify discrimination against trans people, and I provide researched, well corroborated rebuttals to each one of these. So one of the examples of that is people will often get mad that trans and non-binary people are making up words and making up grammar, which I think is so funny because these people aren't speaking Old English. Like, they literally are speaking a language that was created specifically to communicate concepts. There's not a concern around the integrity of grammar or the integrity of language. There's a concern about policing who gets to make language. And time again, queer and trans people, and especially queer and trans people of color and Black people and Indigenous people, are unable to narrate ourselves because we need to be narrated by other people. Just to respond to what's happening all around us, I think it's really important here to understand the particular vulnerabilities faced by Black, trans, and non-binary people, especially in this moment. Places like in Florida, where Tony McDade, a Black trans man, was murdered by the Tallahassee Police Department, are also states that are introducing rampant anti-LGBTQ and anti-trans legislation, which often bars trans people from access to employment, makes them have to live in and work in certain neighborhoods in certain contexts that leave them more hyper-exposed to disproportionate policing. So the architecture of anti-trans and anti-Black violence are interwoven. And I think this moment, it's so important that we uplift the leadership and the experiences of Black trans people.
Absolutely, absolutely. And my final guest is Kimberly Drew, who's the author of This Is What I Know About Art. Hi, Kimberly, welcome. Oh no, Kimberly, you're on mute, my love.
I'm muted. I always mute myself on calls because I'm always just fidgeting. It is such an honor to be joining this incredible group in a number of ways. I feel so many things this week. I am so exhausted right now, so please forgive me and bear with me, and all of us, I must say, in this moment as we try to be our most articulate selves. I wrote a book called This Is What I Know About Art as an offering to young people who are curious about art, who are curious about self-expression, who are curious about the value of their own voice and contributions to culture, really with the intention of providing an invitation to young people to speak up, to join the ranks of so many who have come before us, to share culture through institutions and through other medium. I really was so passionate in the writing of the book to make sure that the book was both a resource and invitation. And so as you're reading the book, I've named a number of artists that have informed the work that I do and the way that I do it. I encourage anyone who takes the time to read the book, and I hope you do, that you read the book with a notebook next to you or with a Google search page open, so that you can continue your own learning. Because I think oftentimes a lot of young people, myself included, because I was very much this young person too, have a lot of fear and anxiety about talking about art or getting engaged with art because they worry they might not get it, or that the intellectual police will come and find you and say, you don't know what you're talking about. And I think what I want to shift the narrative towards is understanding that every experience and opportunity to go to a gallery or go to a museum or turn into a YouTube chat like this one is another opportunity to learn. Like, that's what our institutions do at their best. They are there to educate us in the same way that you go to a movie and leave knowing more about the movie. You go to an art exhibition knowing more about the art exhibition. There's no rhyme, reason, rule, or choreography for how you do it. And so I hope that was well communicated through the book, because that was very much the intention in my writing it.
I'm bringing all four of you onto the screen together right now because it's such a powerful statement to have all of you together. And I want to ask you all together, your book's coming out this week as such a call to each of your communities, but together your communities. What is the one message, I guess, you would really want young readers particularly to take from each of your works? Adam, I'll start with you.
My message is simple, and I think I've seen it in the protests where I realized that anytime I'm in one of the protests here, I can always see at least one queer sign or rainbow flag, and that's made me really proud. And my message is that being queer means that you are never alone because you're part of something greater than yourself, and that queer people have an obligation to show up for each other, period.
Absolutely. Shutezka?
Yeah, I'd say one of the main themes in the book, one of the main messages for youth out there is that our generation's imagination and how we show up in these movements, the diversity of ways we apply our voices, our leadership, our creativity, our own brilliance, our own genius is what is absolutely going to tip the scales towards transformative change. And there are absolutely no limits to the ways in which you show up to fight for what you believe in this space. And it's a canvas for you to play your part, because the challenges that our generation is going to face are absolutely enormous, and it is only matched by the sheer potential of the power that we have.
And Alok?
I would say that we all deserve to live in a world that values creativity over conformity, and that we should learn that complexity is not chaos, it just is.
And Kimberly, I said to step off screen for a moment, so I'll ask another question, and I'm sure she'll return to that one. Vanessa wanted to know, what would each of you say is the first step for someone who wants to become more involved but is unsure about how to go about it? Who wants to? Kimberly,
Hey,
you
y'all,
can
I'm sorry, I got back, so I had to pop out.
Hopefully it was something great.
Wait,
Kimberly,
can I answer the other question?
You absolutely can answer the other question.
So it was like what we hope people take away from our book, right?
Yeah, and particularly I think young readers out there, for teen readers who, this is published for Penguin Teen, and we want our teen readers to embrace these books. What is something a teen reader can take from this book?
Great question. I hope that any teen reader that reads any of our beautiful books or any of the forthcoming 6 books in this series, I hope that they feel, I hope that they feel, I don't know, like like I got flowers today, and I just felt so loved and seen, because I think when you publish a book, there's so many ways that people show up for you, and in my heart of hearts and in maybe like the softest part of my brain, I was like, I really want to get flowers today. And so I just had this like overwhelming feeling of joy. And I hope that for young readers who encounter these texts, that they have that same sensation and feeling where there's something that maybe you've been wanting for a long time, and suddenly the doorbell rings, and that door person or whomever is delivering something to you, they have that exact thing. And that's how I felt reading all of our books, where I'm just like, yeah, I really needed someone to articulate this to me in this particular way. Like, I've marked up all of our books because I'm the queen of like highlighting and marking. And in some books I use pencil and some I use pen, because I was like, I really needed to hear this. And so I hope that that's the sensation and feeling that all the young people, all the people, because the books are definitely written to a young audience, but I think everyone can learn something. I absolutely learned a lot myself, but I hope that that's the feeling.
I was going to bounce off of what you were saying, and I think it's really, really hype that young people are going to get to hear from authors like us. And I think, you know, just in my experience growing up in a lot of these organizing spaces, there wasn't a lot of people that looked like me around me, and there wasn't a lot of resources. You know, like there was a lot of older white folks that were kind of running it in like the local climate and environmental spaces. And even a lot of like the native organizing spaces, there was like a lot of elders, you know, like sitting around and telling stories. So I think I'm really grateful for just like the format, and I also just like how digestible I feel like a lot of this content is. And I think it's, you know, I don't read as much as I want to, and I'm going to start reading, but like I think this is like a doorway. I think this is a really huge doorway for people to like take some of these first steps into understanding and like expanding our mind, expanding our imagination, expanding the way in which we see each one of our, you know, causes in the work that we do. And I think it's again going to lead to, you know, infinite more curiosity, you know, that I'm really excited about. And I'm excited to pass this around to my friends, have my little sister read the series, have my little bro, you know, dive into these books. So I'm just hyped that stuff like this is existing. And that, you know, when Penguin reached out to me, I was really grateful. I was like, wow, like this definitely wasn't a thing, you know, for me, like 10 years ago when I was like, you know, 10 years old, you know, starting to get involved and be curious and ask these questions.
A question that's come through from Carl, which I think, Kimberly, you touched on, but I think it's so interesting for all of you, is in reading each other's works, what surprised you? And I'll ask Adam.
What surprised me? Can you hear me? What surprised me, or maybe not, it didn't surprise me because it's something that I knew would come through, but something that brought me a lot of joy and that made me really excited is the extreme clarity of all of the books, and how like clear the ideas that my co-authors present are sophisticated, and not, people wouldn't assume that deconstructing the gender binary or these ideas are so straightforward, but I think that the language was crystal clear and actively inclusive in a way that a young person can read it, in a way that a person without an academic background can read it. but not just read it, but like read it, understand it, and then be able to explain it to a friend. And I remember vividly when our brilliant editor, Rachel, told me, I started a little bit, and then she told me, imagine writing to someone that's like 14 or to someone that's 12. And when she said that to me, that was such a brilliant moment because it just took all of the pressure off of me to like try to be like a fancy sort of wordsmith. And I just went completely for clarity. And I think that the message from my co-authors' books also, it's crystal clear. And I love that. I think it's more inclusive that way.
Alok, did you learn anything new from any of your co-authors in the Pocket Change series?
I mean, so many different lessons, but I think that what I thought was so powerful is how we all interpreted this kind of prompt differently. Rachel and Carl, our beautiful editors, tasked us with a kind of mini manifesto and writing from that place. And what I found is that actually each of us interpreted that in our own way. And I think I appreciated that because so often manifesto has a connotation. And we show that actually there are many ways to speak, many registers to speak in, and many formats with which to communicate.
I'll jump in to say too, I was like, I have all of them. And I love them all so much. I think the thing that was the most surprising to me in getting to read my fellow co-authors' books was that I followed all of y'all for so long. Like, I remember getting to the Malpensa airport in Milan and like seeing a giant photo of Chetesca, and like we've been on projects together and on set together for like hours of the day. But really being able to learn more about like where your folks are from, being able to hear more about Alok's immigrant experience, being able to hear Adam's voice speaking directly to me in a different way. That was such an incredible privilege, because I think oftentimes too, as public figures, as activists that people look to, there is also a way in which we become avatars. There's also a way in which the dynamism and complications of our everyday life get lost because you might see a single tweet or a single post or, God forbid, a mistake that we make. And that becomes so much of the narrative of our lives. And I like that this book, was just one moment where I really heard Alok speaking to me, which is why I love books in general. Like, I know Alok's voice, and so I heard their voice, but like when you read an author who you don't know what they sound like and you hear them speaking directly to you, that intimate exchange of energy is so special, especially in this moment where so many of us aren't able to connect with each other in ways that we're used to. I even love in moments like this where we're like checking in from our respective domestic spaces. Like, there's so much more texture and color to this moment, or even like going out to protest, like seeing people in that realm where I like had a friend who was handing out PPE, and I just like getting to see you in this context makes this unprecedented moment so much more interesting. And I don't know, it's a lot to digest, but I think in reading the books, I was really, really, really happy and felt so privileged to be able to just more intimately understand where you, my friends, were coming from.
Yeah, and I think hearing the voices, I should absolutely add that all of these books are available on audio format as read by their authors. So definitely, if you're interested in an audio format edition of any of these 4 books in the Pocket Change Collective series, you can find them on all audio platforms. This next question from Elise I actually really love, which is, how would you like to see your book applied in other forms in terms of teaching or learning or activism? And I'll start with Chetesca with that.
Definitely. I published a book a couple years ago, I guess in 2017, and it's pretty funny. Like I go back and I read it and I'm like, oh my gosh, like just the amount of growth I've experienced since then, and just my perspectives and how I don't know. I read it and I'm like, it's like, one of those like projects that you share when you were younger that you're like kind of embarrassed about a little bit. But it was really powerful because I wrote that book 3 years ago, and just last year in 2019, I went and connected with university students at colleges across the country that had taken that book and adapted it into, like, done months of research and work to design curriculum around the book. And I was like, this is a book that I think is like 1/3 of, it communicates like 1/3 of the maturity and I think like the complexity and the power of what I think I put into this book in the Pocket Change Collective. And just to see though the way that these teachers that really care about their students and that really care about sharing something that can be applied for these youth beyond their classroom, I think is really, really powerful. And so I think all of our books could really benefit to be applied in curriculum. I think because our perspectives are so applied and like we live it on a regular basis, and I think that really comes through in the writing. I think it's just something that is very real and raw for many of these other young people out there. And so it was something very empowering that I saw with my last book, and I think will be really excited to see how it is taken and just like interpreted and shaped. And I don't know. Yeah, and I think every person will interact with it differently, but I think just like seeing it show up in curriculum for these different young people who are studying it, who are connecting with it, I think is going to be really, really beautiful.
Kimberly?
Yeah, I love the curriculum ad. Like, I love librarians who are like, I'm gonna put this on, you know. Shout out to librarians. We love you. We see you. We affirm you. I was definitely a library kid. Shout out to the Orange Public Library. I love y'all. I think for me, yeah, being able to see these texts, you know, used as teaching tools, because that's really how they're all written. But also as like the thing that like helps, I don't know, this sounds facetious. It's a half thought, but like, I love bragging through books, you know, like there's that ridiculous John Waters quote that's like, don't sleep with anyone if you like don't like the books on their bookshelf. And I think for me, I really like the idea that like a young person or whomever might be reading this book on the subway or wherever they find themselves, or they're ruffling through their bag on a first date and they're like, you know, like slowly kind of showing the book as they're rifling through everything else. Like, I want these books to help people confirm the ways that they tell the world who they are, you know, in the ways in which their values align with these books. And I think that's the coolest thing. Like, you know, people shame people doing stuff for the clout, but I'm like, I mean, use this as a vehicle for the clout. Why not?
I love that so much. What about you, Adam?
I absolutely agree with what Kimberly was talking about in terms of like using books as clout. As you can see, I'm sitting very intentionally behind my big fancy bookcase. And when I was moving, I was like, the only reason to have an apartment is to like be able to have somewhere to like have like your books be kept there forever. And I really, really believe that. And something that I don't know if this counts as a curriculum, but my book speaks to, at its core, an intersectional identity. It speaks to the identity of queer and Jewish. And a brilliant woman named Abby Stein, who is an incredible activist, wrote for the foreword about how after COVID-19, the Jews that have traditionally been on the margin, so that means like trans Jews, queer Jews, Jews of color, specifically Black Jews, have been like coming to the forefront and demanding more, not even just representation, but full throttle inclusion. And so I mean, it would be a dream come true to see this book used as what an intersectional Jewish identity can look like. And I ask people to close their eyes and imagine something that is fundamental to who they are. And I say it can be like where you live, or even like a sports team that like your family's obsessed with, but something that you were born with that's irremovable from you. And so that's one hope. And the other is I talk about how it's my dream that the idea that queer people anywhere are responsible for queer people everywhere, or the idea that queer people should show up for each other and be really, really nice to each other, become a fundamental part of what it means to be queer. Like right now in the queer community, things that are fundamental are like pop music is a really big deal in the queer community, and like people talk about it a lot. I'm sitting in front of like 2 queer fashion icons. Like fashion is something that is like generally accepted to be interested in within the queer community, and I want just be like a duh or an obvious that because we're queer, we're nice to each other. And if we see another queer person suffering, that's without a blink, that's on us to show up for.
Absolutely. And look, I know these books being in schools is incredibly important to you, as it is to everyone on the panel. Is there a way that you see this being taught, or learning from it that is something that I think teachers who are watching could take?
Yeah, sure. I think, as I sort of began saying, we're living in a country right now that is unfortunately pursuing legal discrimination against trans and gender nonconforming young people. And a lot of these young people are experiencing a lot of bullying and harassment in schools. I receive messages all the time of parents literally moving away from their school districts because their kids are getting attacked at school, and parents themselves getting attacked for having a trans kid. And so I really hope that this book gives people legitimacy and affirmation. And I think that the role of an educator is not just to communicate information, but also to affirm for a lot of people who might not be getting that affirmation from their friends or from their homes. So I really hope that this equips teachers as well as students with the language to articulate why trans and gender nonconforming people are essential, but also to respond to the discrimination that we face, which is particularly heightened right now.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
It was grueling. I'm just kidding. Actually, it was grueling in some ways. I write a lot. I write a lot on Instagram. I write a lot in text messages. I write a lot in publications. And I often find myself having this almost like amnesia every time I go to, especially to write longer form, where I feel like I almost like forget how to write every time I start something new. An exercise of mine is like returning to other things I've written to be like, you are a good writer. You are a writer who writes words, and you are a good one. Because I think we all need those like confidence boosts and reminders. I think especially in this context, and I want to echo what Adam was saying. It was really difficult, or even like Adam and I would run into each other at bars and be like, "Are you okay? Like, how are you? How far are you? Are you reaching your deadline?" So it definitely doesn't come without a certain degree of stress. It definitely doesn't come without a certain degree of just like self-interrogation. But for me, I think I just kept remembering, like, there are young people out there who will read this book. There are people of all walks of life who will read this book. And the desire that I have for them to hear these stories is so much deeper than the ways in which I am limiting myself or the ways in which my imposter syndrome is showing up. And also to make sure that, like Adam said, to make sure that the words that I'm writing are as legible as possible. Because I think for so many of us, we've read scholars or people that we really respect, and you read the paragraph once, twice, thrice, and don't know what they're saying. And so for me, it was really important to make sure that I was going back and editing myself, that I employed a few friends to be editors and read the book for me, to make sure that what I was saying was what I meant to say. And so that for me was my writing process, was like doing it really community based, and then also remembering that it is for a community.
Adam, how was it for you, the writing process?
First of all, I definitely echo what Kimberly said, and I remember those moments very, very viscerally. And one of them actually really helped me when Kimberly was like, you just have to like do it. Like, you just got to like press send on that draft. And then I went home and I spent like an hour on it, and then I did. Something that I found that I didn't know about myself and that I didn't understand, but now do, is I would set aside time and I'd be like, I wrote a lot at my parents' home. My mom's on the call. Hi, Mom. That's my grandma. What I didn't know was that I'd be like, okay, I'm going to write on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, and like clear out like those 3 days. And like, I can't do that. I can't do that at all, it turns out. Like, I could like write, like 6 hours, like sitting there, like getting it out, and I'm fried. Like, the next day, I would like sit back in front of the paper with like all this time laid out in front of me, and I couldn't do it. And so I realized that it's not about like, for me, it's not about like the time and the silence. It's about the fatigue, because I find writing emotionally draining in general, but particularly I found this experience writing about myself and the things I want to see changed in the world really, really, really draining. And I hope that it was drained in a good way, because I hope it drained out of me and went into the book.
Yeah. I definitely missed a lot of deadlines. And at the same time, the Penguin team was really, really dope to work with. I really appreciate it. Rachel was on point. I was really, really raw. And I felt like that for me, the last couple years especially, I've like kind of just rejected any level of attempting to like appear with the aura of like professionalism or anything that isn't authentic to like how I really feel and am and communicate. And so like the book is very much reflects that. And I think it felt really good to have like a template, because like when I write music, when I write lyrics, it's very much so uncensored, like a download that gets communicated onto paper. And I think, you know, this book offered that platform for me to do the same thing. And I had, you know, like my girlfriend helped craft some parts of it that were like, the book wouldn't be nearly as good as it was if she didn't put her eyes on and just like help me think through so much of it. So I think definitely having people that are close to you, that you trust to be like, yo, bro, that's pretty whack. Like, you should rewrite that whole part right there. Like, people that will be honest with you, I think that's really important. Wouldn't have been that good if she hadn't stepped in, and just different people that have been supportive throughout the process. Really, really grateful. Penguin team, shout out. And yeah, it felt good to have something that just, I felt really reflected who I am and my stage of the journey at that time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to give the last question to a person you all know well and have shouted out today a little bit, which is the lovely Rachel Sonis, who has been your editor supreme. And she, first of all, one, wanted to say, I'm so proud of you all. And two, for many of you, art in its many forms is inherently connected to protest. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship, how art feeds activism and vice versa? So Alok, I'll hand to you.
Sure. I always say that political art is an oxymoron, because the only thing that's actually artful in the world is paying attention to the political landscape. I think for me, with this book in particular, there was many political motivations to write it, because we exist in a country, and I think this relates to what our folks were saying before, where a lot of gender theory is just so academic and gate-kept from especially trans and gender nonconforming people. We're seen as kind of we're seen as objects of academic theory, but never actually able to produce our own knowledge. And so because there's such a scarcity of literature around this topic, I wanted to actually do something different and write to and for trans and gender nonconforming young people. I've been trained in gender studies for a very long time, so it was really hard for me to at first like winnow it down to what I was actually trying to say, because I can do very flowery language. I'm a poet. But what I began to realize is the politics of accessibility and protesting the ways in which we are tasked with writing kind of like in this white intellectual male way as a way to be seen as legitimate. But actually, what I've learned from poetry is that actually language can be political if it's actually in its most refined parts. And that so often a lot of these big dissertations and tomes can be reduced down to a sentence or two. So I guess one of the political engagements I saw in the series was a question of accessibility.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Chutezkat, for you, the sort of crossroads of activism and art, how does that work for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's very, very big in my life. And I put out this last album with my boy True, who's an artist from LA, and it, I think, really spoke to everything I've been going through in my life of just reflecting my identity and putting that in creating kind of a creative and artistic template. And I think really being in these social movements, like it's exhausting, you know. And for me, art has been a way for me to reclaim my power in these spaces. And also remind myself of who I am, and has been a form of holding on to a lot of sovereignty for myself in the way I show up, in the way I represent myself, in the way that people oftentimes like to project stories and narratives of who I am, of the work I do, of the way I'm represented in a reality. Like art has been always a place for me to like reclaim that, take that back. And yeah, so I think, you know, hip hop specifically is such a historically, you know, political way of engaging with the world, and I think comes from such rich, beautiful heritage, you know. And I think I'm just grateful to be able to like use, be a part of a movement and a culture that is so much more complex than just rap music. And I was talking about that, you know, earlier today on another interview of just like the complexities of hip hop and how that has shown up for me in my organizing and in the movement work that I've done, and how I see it around me in these spaces. And it's really beautiful to see the generation of young artists that are rising up, you know, alongside me, and that I really look towards for inspiration, that are breaking so many even creative barriers within hip hop, within these different genres that perpetuate a lot of violence, whether it's towards women, whether it's towards ourselves or our own communities. You know, it's I think there's a wave, I think, of really, you know, powerful art through this lens of hip hop that I'm really inspired by. And I think that's just, you know, reflected in my book and how that's helped me through this journey.
Mm-hmm. Adam, you mentioned being in here in New York as the protests are outside your window, and it's that perfect, not perfect, it's the diagram of, you know, art and protest. How important is that moment to you?
Well, I wanna answer it two really quick ways. The first is that anyone who thinks that putting on a protest doesn't involve art is like, I don't even know what to do with that, because you come up with the concept and an idea, and then you have like 30 or like a whole bunch of artists execute the vision, because protest is all about drawing attention to an issue and making a message clear, and you do that with words and visuals. So art is, just from like a very, very logistical perspective, like art is integral to protest. Look at the silence equal death sign. It's about visuals and communicating a message. And the other thing I wanted to say is that when I was approached to write this book by Rachel, I really did not think of myself as a creative or an artist. And I thought of myself as an activist and a community organizer. And writing this book and being asked to was a really big turning point for me, in seeing myself as a creative person and a creator. And I'm just very, very grateful to Rachel and Penguin for that.
Absolutely. And Kimberly?
I was like, pick me. I love what everyone has said. I mean, it's so funny because I wrote this book, even though I was running into Alok and running into Adam at the time of writing. I wrote this somewhat in a vacuum. And so it was really nice to see the ways in which art and creativity really also directly relate to all of our struggles as people who are interested and active in protest. But I would say, you know, exactly what Adam said, there is no way to communicate and disperse information and bring people in and get people on your side that is better than what art can do. Like, I just wrote a piece for Teen Vogue specifically about this week in protest, and it is the illustrators, it is the graphic designers, it is the organizers, it is the poets, it is the musicians, it is so many people who are moving creatively that help us to better understand where to be, how to be, and for what we're showing up for. And so these two things are inextricably tied. And so it's really important to remember that always, especially for anyone who's an artist who watches this dialogue, to remember that, like, you have the potential to really help people. You have the potential to really heal people through the work that you do, even if your work isn't explicitly political in the ways that you may see it yourself as a creator, because that's your full right and agency as author. But you are part of a political process in some way. And so, yeah, they're right there together.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, we are actually out of time. It has been such wonderful to chat to all of you today and to hear all about your books. The Pocket Change Collective series was a series born out of a need for space to think, space to connect, space to be yourself, and these books were that invitation. So I want to thank Kimberly Drew, whose book is This Is What I Know About Art, it's out now. Adam Eli, whose book is The New Queer Conscience, out now. Alok Vaid-Menon, whose book is Beyond the Gender Binary. And then finally, Shutez Kat Martinez, whose book is Imaginary Borders. All four of these amazing authors will have events on their own social media in the coming weeks, and their conversations, I'm sure, will be illuminating, so I encourage you to follow them. Thank you once again for joining us on Penguin Teen, and please make sure to pick up a copy or all four other copies of the Pocket Change Collective. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Go get it. Love you.